Well, welcome back, everyone, to Speeding Through History. We are continuing this series, but as you can see on the left of your screen is a different face. We've talked to Don Gamble for 8 weeks. Huge shout out to Don. What a great storyteller he is. I think I think Don probably maybe we have cracked about 1% of the capacity of his brain in telling racing stories. We're going to get Don back in the future. Don asked to step aside and brings a few more faces in, and that is what we have done. Dave Kohler joins us. I would consider Dave a racing historian only because of all the experiences he has had down through the years. And Dave, I'm going to start the way I started with Don on the very first episode. I want you to summon up a very young Dave Kohler and tell me, sir, where did all this start? Where did this passion come from?
Well, I essentially I grew up around racing. My parents took myself and my brother to the Heidelberg Raceway, which was not too far away. My uncle Art Daly was a track announcer at Heidelberg back in the '60s. So he did announcing and PR. So that was one of the places that I first started attending races at. And then South Park was another racetrack. He announced there. I never went to Debo, which was in Ohio. He did announce there on occasion. Um, but that kind of started all, at Heidelberg Raceway. When you're a little kid and you're around that, kind of you absorb it into your blood, and I certainly did. My dad grew up with the Linder brothers, Gus and Dick Linder in the Brookline area. So he knew them, they knew him, and having that association, I had somebody to cheer for as a kid, and watch while they were racing. I didn't get to see Dick race, but I got to see Gus race, all the way through the end of his career, and he attended some of the racers reunions that Don Gamble put together. So that kind of started all. Just a big fan of going to Heidelberg all the way through from the dirt era all the way through the asphalt days to the closing of the racetrack. And probably like many, when I woke up one day, I think in October, November, December, I don't recall when, the newspaper article came out that the Heidelberg Raceway was going to be closed and never to open again. And that was a massive disappointment because that was a great place to go on Saturdays. I made a lot of friends there. Kenny Conzos, Bill Conzo's son, Donna Starner, who her dad was the flagman at Heidelberg at the time. Brenda Mitchell, her dad, Ed Mitchell, was a driver. We all sat together. The Gurman family, they owned a car that Don Diver drove, and we all sat together in the same area in the grandstands, which, as everyone knows, those grandstands are out of Pennsylvania Motor Speedway these days. So I still look down on that area and think back, my time at Heidelberg and the friends I made there, and back during one of Don Gamble's racers reunion, Kenny Conzos and his wife showed up, and they enjoyed it. They were able to reminisce and talk about the days of Heidelberg and Kenny's dad racing at Heidelberg, and big scoring mix up when his dad won, and then they gave it to Tom Mayer and that whole bit. So Heidelberg closed. I really didn't have a racetrack to go to. There were racetracks in the area, but I didn't lose all passion for racing, but that was a big blow losing Heidelberg. So I never really made it to a lot of racetrack for a few years. Um, Pittsburgh was opened in the late '70s. Made my way out there, and I went, "Wow, this is great. This is a lot like Heidelberg when it was dirt." That led to Lernerville and all the other racetracks in the area. So I was able to go to the Friday night races at Lernerville, Saturday at Pittsburgh, go to Motordrome on Sundays, and you had a full weekend of racing. North Hills on Thursday nights. I made it up there a few times. That was a track I knew nothing about until later on in time. But I did attend some events there, really enjoyed it. It was a small track, but it was a fun little racetrack. Um, and then just from there, I think what happened, one of my trips out to Pennsylvania Motor Speedway, I don't know how Mike Nelson and I became friends, but I met Mike. I met another guy who I sit with at Lernerville, Keith Donnelly, and we all became friends, and somehow Mike got involved with selling sponsors for one of the Pittsburghers at Pennsylvania Motor Speedway. And I think it was the Racing News 100 at the time, is what they called it. The Racing News was a racing paper, and I think they sponsored it. So Mike asked me to help him sell lap sponsors. So I did that. And that was kind of I guess, my first foray into the business end of racing. Um, from there, I still went to the races there, and then somehow Mike got involved at Jennerstown Speedway. I got involved at Jennerstown Speedway and ended up working full time for the Laskies at Jennerstown. Mike ended up working full time for the Laskies at Jennerstown, and we kind of did our thing for a few years. And then at the end of the 91 season, some things changed, and I had an opportunity to go to Nashville, Tennessee. So I packed up. I called the promoter of the speedway down there. I found out that they were looking for a PR director. I had gone to the race. Mike Nelson, John Carahalis, who was a dentist, us three went to Nashville to promote the year-end race, I think, at Jennerstown. And we went to the All-American 400. And the first thing I said when I walked into the Nashville Speedway is, boy, if there was a town I'd love to move to, it would be Nashville, Tennessee. Well, I ended up doing that in 1992, and I ended up staying there for 10 years, 10 racing seasons. Fell in love with Nashville. Actually, it was the best time of my life in racing, that 10 years in Nashville. It ended. The track was sold. Dover bought it. They had proposed a super speedway, built the super speedway. They were going to build a drag strip, a short track, asphalt track, and a short track dirt track. That went by the wayside. And at that point, I thought, okay, I know where my future is. So I left Nashville and moved back to Pittsburgh, and I got involved in doing track announcing at some of the local racetracks. I did Motordrome for a year for the Mileys. I filled in at Pittsburgh a number of times. Towards the end of the year, Dal Carnahan would take up his avocation in broadcasting at the radio with uh, football and at the local football stadiums, I guess. So he'd call me or he'd text me and say, "Hey, would you mind filling in?" So I'd do that. I'd fill in for Dow and always enjoyed that. It was a lot of fun. Um, I did through my association with Motordrome and Jennerstown, because I did trackside announcing at Motordrome. Mike was the announcer, and I was a trackside announcer. Through that association, meeting Ron Brutt, who was the race director at the time at both Jennerstown and Motordrome, he was involved in the ownership of the Roaring Knob Motorsports Complex. So he invited me up. I went up there, and Dave Kitty was the track announcer. And Dave would, towards the end of the year in September, Dave would venture out to Eldora to go to the World 100. So I knew Dave, and he'd say, "Hey, you want to fill in for me?" So I'd fill in for him. And then there were times I think he got ill and he couldn't make it, or something happened, or a race came up that he wanted to go to, and he'd say, "Hey, you want to fill in for me?" So I'd fill in at Roaring Knob. I did that quite a number of nights at the Speedway there, and did that for a number of years. Kind of got out of the announcing end of it. I think kind of like you, when the knees get going, it's a little difficult to get up and down those steps and at the hustle pace that we used to do. So I said, that's enough. I'm done. And I just sit in the grandstands and enjoy watching the races these days.
Well, that's a story, and that is quite a career you've had. And you and I have been friends for, oh, I'd say about 20 years probably. Both of us have been involved in Don's Rapping on Racing program on radio and then podcast later on. And there's got to be a lot of stories behind all the miles you put on between Pittsburgh and Nashville and all the different tracks you saw. I want to go all the way back to nearly the beginning. Talk about, because so many of us and so many of the people that are watching this, we never experienced Heidelberg. Tell us about what a Saturday night at Heidelberg felt like.
Um, you know, it, back in the dirt, I remember some of the dirt days. I was at Pittsburgh for their opener this year, and I'm looking at the racetrack and the way the cars had pushed the dirt up the racetrack. I said to a friend of mine, Jim Witzberger, who was actually Ed Witzberger's nephew, he was sitting with me and another friend, Bill Simpson, and I said, I look in those turns, it looks almost like Heidelberg, the way they used to push the dirt up, up towards the wall. And Heidelberg was that way. It was just magic because I'm a young kid. I didn't know any better. I just enjoyed going to the races. So, I'd be at the racetrack at Heidelberg unless I got grounded. If my grades were bad, I was grounded. I didn't get to go to the races. So I had to make sure my grades were good. So if any youngsters are listening, make sure your grades are good so you don't get grounded from going to the races. But it was, you'd see Herb Scott, Don Luffy, Norm Benning, Joe Mihalik, Don Divert, Don Dale, Bob James. You'd see all these guys racing on dirt. The track got paved at the end of the 66 season, I believe, and it was made into an asphalt track. I think Ed Wutzberger saw the light as far as asphalt racing, so the track got paved. And ironically, not a lot of the dirt drivers took up the asphalt racing. Some of them did, but a lot of them didn't and decided to go dirt track racing at the other dirt tracks, which I understand. Some did. Tom Kalala was one of them. He started out in dirt. Ironically, Tom had a real narrow racing career. Started out on dirt, ended up on asphalt. Watched him race on asphalt, became an incredibly accomplished asphalt racer. Um, he got hooked up with Bobby Allison. Allison built him a car. He won a lot of races. They traveled all over the country, Canada and Michigan and Ohio and wherever else they could, and won races with that car, either Tom or other drivers. So, even when track transitioned to asphalt, you'd have all these Ohio cars come in, Michigan cars would come. Bob Seneker would make it his weekly racetrack back in the 70s. He traveled from Michigan every Saturday night to race at Heidelberg. Don Gregory, the Saint Amant team, they'd come up from Columbus, Ohio. They'd race every weekend at Heidelberg. Ray Thomas from the Cleveland area, Bill Conzos from up around the Cleveland area. There were so many of those drivers. I never heard of them, never saw them race before. And they started showing up at Heidelberg, and you're like, where did these guys come from? What's the story with all of them? And then you start. What I did, when I was at Heidelberg, I sold the racing publications for Joe LaRue. Joe was the legendary racing guy that sold the racing papers, and he had been around Heidelberg for a lot of years. His son Larry was involved at the track, but I started reading those racing papers that I was selling, and that that's how I got accustomed to who some of these drivers were. So I got to the point I read so much of these racing papers and found out about all these different drivers. I'm like, well, we need to get more drivers in here so I can see who they are and how they match up against our local guys. Lo and behold, the end of the year, they ran the Pittsburgher, and a lot of those guys that I'm reading about showed up at Heidelberg Raceway, and you'd have a massive field of asphalt late models at that racetrack to race against the local guys. And the out of towners were good. There was no question about it. They won a lot of those races. The Ohio guys were good. But again, you got to go back. A lot of the dirt guys that ran at Heidelberg for a lot of years did not transition over. So I think the numbers were smaller with the asphalt uh, Western PA drivers. You know, Kenny Hemphill, he came along and he impressed a lot of people. He was very good. He won races, a championship, went on to better his career. His son Ryan ended up racing. So, you know, Heidelberg was just it was a track. It was a very special track, obviously, because I grew up with it and I died with it. Because that track, when it gone, it broke my heart and it broke a lot of people's hearts in this area because when it went away, that was it. So it was a lot of good Saturday nights, a lot of good nights during the week, and made a lot of friends and really enjoyed the racing there.
We're joined on Speeding Through History by Dave Kohler, Dave, local racing historian. Dave, you we'll talk little about this in a moment. You contribute quite a bit to the two Facebook pages that have come up in the last few years, the Decades of Dirt page and the Western Pennsylvania History page. We're going to get to that here in a little bit, or maybe even next time, because I want to keep you around. You have a lot of stories. But you mentioned a list of drivers, starting with Herb Scott, that ran on the dirt at Heidelberg. Okay, so you're there watching it. You're in the moment. You're not really aware, and regardless of your age and how attuned you were to what was going on. You know, when it's happening in the moment, you're not thinking about it. But looking back now, you know, these are the people whose shoulders we stand on. They really, I mean, they
Yeah.
plowed the road for everybody that came behind them. I mean, talk about, talk about individually, but talk about their legacy. The guys you named, you know, what has come since then?
Well, you know, one thing I will mention, I've taught over the years, and working in racing, working out of racing, or people finding out that I worked in racing, and I went to Heidelberg. One name stood out amongst all the drivers from Heidelberg Raceway through the dirt years and the asphalt years, and that name was Herb Scott. Herb Scott won 10 championships at that racetrack. Everybody knew who Herb Scott was. When I look at some of these Facebook posts, you know, on the Heidelberg Raceway historical page that Paul Fay put together for John Stasiak in his memory, a lot of people always came up and said, "Boy, I'd go to that racetrack." And the big name that always came up was Herb Scott because Herb was a big winner. Herb did it right. Herb drove the zero, and then it became number one, and he was in a pink car. And not many guys back then drove pink cars. Don't tell that to Herb Scott because Herb was as tough as nails, and he was one of the best in the business. You know, he traveled and he went to the Race of Champions one year. I think when they had it at Trenton, maybe can clarify that his son, and he was one of the top runners, even you know in that arena. So Herb Scott was always to me was the biggest name in racing. My favorite driver the whole time dirt when he was there was Don Luffy. Don was just a great guy, always had a big smile on his face. Ed Miller's a big Don Luffy fan, and he'll tell you that. I built a model car of Don Luffy's race car. Had a little help from my parents, but I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years old. I don't even remember. And gave it to Don, and he hung that in the window of his garage on Route 88, which was pretty impressive. You know, I'd go by there and I'd smile, or we'd stop in and I'd talk to him, and he always took time out of his work to say hi or talk to me or set me in his race car or whatever. So those were the two big names, you know, Buddy O'Connor, Joe Mihalik, Johnny Orban. Um, Danny Ofjanak. There were guys that probably a lot of people today don't know who they were, but they were the bread and butter guys at Heidelberg Raceway that put the show on every weekend. They were the guys that I went there to watch race and put on a show, and they did every Saturday night, whether it was dirt. I loved the 57 Chevys that they ran at Heidelberg back on the dirt days, and Then when it became time to come to Heidelberg and the asphalt guys, Tom Colella was a big name in the asphalt wars when Heidelberg switched over. He won a lot of races. So, it was a good time. Joe Mihalik was a big winner on the asphalt as well as the dirt. So it was a good time at a racetrack in a good period of my life that I got to see that kind of racing. One thing I remember that when I would sell those racing papers and I'd take them home and I'd read them, there were two tracks that I always read about that I always said, boy, I'd love to go to those two racetracks because they always had a lot of cars and they always had a lot of big races. One was Birmingham, Alabama, the Speedway there, and Nashville, Tennessee. And I made it to both of those racetracks in my time in Nashville. I worked at Nashville, obviously, but I'd get on to Birmingham to promote our Nashville races when they'd run the Southern All-Star Series there. That track is long gone. The mayor didn't like it there, so he had it bulldozed. So it's part of history, like Heidelberg Raceway, and it was just a good time in racing.
Dave, before we move on from Heidelberg, I want you to talk about you were sort of at on the ground floor of getting the historical marker put up at, I guess it's Raceway Plaza now, where Heidelberg once stood. I didn't get a chance to go to that ceremony. I would have liked to, but how big of an undertaking was it, and how important was it to you to have it done?
Well, it was vitally important because I wanted that racetrack to be remembered. I wanted somebody to drive by there and go, "Hey, that's pretty cool. I remember Heidelberg Raceway." And then they can think back of the memories that they had going to the Heidelberg Raceway. So, and when I found out about that, I went I went to the Heidelberg Borough building and talked to I think it was the borough manager, Joe Cower, I think was his name. I know a lot of the Cowers. I worked with one of them at one time, but he was, I think, the borough manager, and he and I sat down and we actually got into a heated discussion about it because he wanted he wanted it to primarily be about the circus at Heidelberg Raceway, and I said, wait a minute. The circus wasn't the primary thing at Heidelberg Raceway. The circus came to an end at Heidelberg Raceway. Heidelberg Raceway was the pinnacle of what that track was all about. And he didn't see it that way. And, when we were trying to put together the text for the marker, he kind of split it up. I wasn't happy about it. There were a lot of people that weren't, but I understood why he wanted to do it the way he did. So it's there. It's a part of the history of that racetrack. It's a marker for people to look at and talk about if they do. So it was just it when we did that ceremony. I got a hold of Don Gamble and I said, let's get as many people as we can. So he sent out a blast email. I think he said to like 500 or 600 people. And we originally were going to do it in the I think where the Rite Aid store is. We were going to do it or I'm sorry, the Walgreens store. We were going to try and get their parking lot. And I looked at it and I said, you know what? That isn't where the track was. So I went over to the King's restaurant and I asked the manager, I said, hey, this is what we want to do. We want to do they're going to do a historical marker here. I want to get race cars brought in here. There are some older race cars, some newer race cars. Jim Witzberger brought his car, and I explained to him the association he had with the racetrack Heidelberg, and the guy he was thrilled. He said, "Bring all the race cars you can." They set up a tent, and we did the ceremony out in the grass area in front of the what was the King's Family Restaurant at the time. And surprisingly to everybody, over 400 people showed up. And those 400 people were Heidelberg Raceway workers, fans, drivers, car owners, anybody that, super snuffers, anybody that had involvement at the Heidelberg Raceway showed up for that event. Dawn and I, after the event was over, it rained. It was odd because when I was doing I was talking about Heidelberg Raceway. um, it started to rain, and I'm standing there, and I'm got an electrical microphone, and I'm like, can we get somewhere where I can get cover over me because I don't want to get electrocuted. So they had a tent. We went under the tent and finished I think we went under the tent. I may have stayed out there in the rain and finished talking about it. I don't really remember. But Dawn and I went into the Kings to get something to eat. And two of the guys that were involved in putting that together came over. They saw Dawn and I sitting there. They walked over. I think they were two council members, if I remember. They walked over to our table, thanked us for doing it, and said, we couldn't believe, we figured there were only going to be like 15 to 20 people show up. The guy said, we estimated there were over 400 people there. And we said, well, we expected that because we knew how the racing people are. And so we just sat there and ate our meal, and they thanked us, and we just had a good time talking about that.
About 5 minutes ago here, Dave, I want you to touch on something else. The way Heidelberg has touched so many people over the years. Now, in that time frame, you had South Park and you had Monduke and you had Clinton and you had several others. But tell me if you agree with this. Heidelberg, we talked about the drivers and what their legacy means. But I think Heidelberg Raceway sort of set the standard for what is now stock car racing in Western Pennsylvania. I mean, it was the track. Am I right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Ed Witzberger was so far ahead of his time on what he did. It set the stage for obviously for Pittsburgh, but for a lot of the other racetracks around here. Mike Nelson and I often thought about Jennerstown going to pavement was because of Heidelberg and the success it had. Stan Lasky will probably tell you different, and he's probably right. But I think Piney got tired of dealing with the dirt, maybe, and decided to put pavement down because he saw the popularity of pavement at Jennerstown, and Mike and I promoted the heck out of that place. Heidelberg was a big part of Mike Nelson and I promoting Jennerstown Speedway because we saw a lot of the people that went to Heidelberg would come to our promotions. I during the racing season, I do up to 50 to 60 promotional appearances a year, going to shopping malls, going to community events, going to parades. We did the bicentennial parade in Bridgeville. They had a big bicentennial parade. We had Lynn Geisler's race car there. We had Ben Miley's race car there. The car that my friend and I, Fran Maslonic, we built, we dragged that through the parade. So, you know, Heidelberg, Pittsburgh, Jennerstown, which were all part of my life, I think had some nucleus from the Heidelberg Raceway and how they succeeded because they all did it at some point in juncture. Heidelberg, Jennerstown, and Pittsburgh were successes, and it's great to see Pittsburgh still going. It's great to see Jennerstown still going and being well run and Pittsburgh being well run with new ownership. It's racing. Not everything's going to be perfect. Never expect it to be, and you just keep moving on and getting it better.
We have been joined by Dave Kohler. Dave, I think if you'll accept the invitation, I'd like to do this again next week. We're going to let you go back and sort of reset and talk about some of the things you have gone through your years of promoting, being a fan. I do want to touch on one thing before we let you go, though, and I have to read this to make sure I have it right. You listed a whole bunch of things that you did in racing, but I see something here that said you co-hosted the Shop at Home Network show in Nashville, Tennessee. That's a little
I
bit off
did.
the page, isn't it?
It is. Trying to think back how that came about. I'm thinking a guy. There was two people involved in this. Dan, I can't think of his last name. He was the on-air talent, and a guy named George who put it all together. He came to the Speedway and he found me at the Speedway. And he sat down in my office and said, how would you be interested in co-hosting a Shop at Home Network show at a studio north of here? And I said, I've done TV, I've done radio. Yeah, why not? I said, obviously, is there any pay involved? And he said, we'll get you some money. So I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. So I did that. I think I want to say, I don't know if it was once every 2 weeks or once a month, but we went through an entire racing season or two racing seasons of me going to the shop at home studio, which was north of Nashville. We'd go into the studio and both of us would stand up. Ironically, Kevin O'Brien, who was at the time, he worked for the Dover organization. He was a PR guy at Long Beach Grand Prix. He called me up after one of the shows. He called me up and said, "Did I see you at a Shop and Home network show on TV?" And I said, "Yeah, you did." He goes, "I thought that was you." He picked it up on satellite in California
Oh my.
and was watching it. And I'm selling Randy Sellers dirt late models on Shop at Home, and I'm selling other little um cars, the diecast cars on the Shop at Home show. And that's how the show became successful and how it became, because it was all done around, the die-cast industry, which was extremely big back then. Back in the 90s, the die-cast industry was massive, so they were taking advantage of it. And we sold a lot of die-cast cars. I got my mug on TV. I made a little extra money, and I had a good time.
Just real quick before we wrap up talking about diecasts, you certainly have a memory of that silver number three Dale
Right.
Earnhardt diecast. I mean, the price of that thing just went through the roof after its initial offering.
Yeah, it did. And I had one of the people that I worked with in Nashville, Velma Jones. She at one time was the general manager. Her husband at the time, Steve Jones, worked for Bill Elliott, and he did a lot of that. He did a lot of the die cast and the souvenirs and stuff for Bill. So, I had somebody to lean on if I needed to lean on somebody to ask questions to. But yeah, speaking of Dale Earnhardt with the good wrench on the side of the car, that became probably well, undoubtedly the most recognized sponsor on a race car. The biggest reason was it was because it was the easiest to read on a race car. It was all block letters. It was a black background with white lettering. That was his signature, was the black number three with a white good wrench on it. And that's how people knew about Goodwrench, because they made it very recognizable, very easy to read. I look at some of these cars today and they go by the grandstands and are like, what number is that first off? And I cannot read any of those sponsors on those cars. So if you want me to go to one of your sponsors, forget it, because I can't read it.
No, I completely agree. I couldn't agree more. In fact, I was going to ask you about that very thing. Dave Kohler has been our guest. He's going to be our guest again. Dave, next time we get together, we do have to wrap it up now, but next time you and I get together, you had a lot of involvement in the Pittsburgh Circle Track Club, and I want to hear about the history of the Circle Track Club and what you all did. Once again, this is Speeding Through History. You have been listening to myself, Jim Zufall, and Dave Kohler has been gracious enough to join us here this week, and we're going to try to do it again next week. Please join us then on Speeding Through History.